Hello, Miss Sneed, and thank you for joining me. After doing some research and reading your bio, I knew you were the person to come to because you want to tell stories that are often overlooked and untold. I'm sure you know the history of African Americans in Hollywood, how we have been depicted on screen from advertising to TV to cinema. We have been typecast and stereotyped and almost assured to be the rapist, the murderer, the thief, the drug dealer, drug addict, or the servant. We must change our image in Hollywood in order to change our image in society and all over the world. Where do we start? Remember Aunt Jemima and Rastas, the chef on the cream of wheat box? Where is there to look up to in that? We had Hattie McDaniel playing Mammy in Gone with the Wind. Where's the pride in that? Do you remember Amos and Andy? They dressed in blackface and portrayed us in a manner that wasn't thorough to our community. It was the depiction of what they thought our community was. When I look at the big screen or television today, I still don't see our community. I see someone else's idea of what our community must be. The constant negative portrayals of us and our community has affected us and our children tremendously. Who are we most commonly casted as in the industry? Again, the gangster, the servant, the hooker, the crackhead, the thief, or murderer. Let's change the perspective of a dysfunctional culture full of negativity, black-on-black crime, drug culture, sexism, the exploitation of black women, and the fact that young black women believe showing their body and shaking their behind is the only way to get attention in the industry. If we don't change our image on screen, we will never change our image in society. Let's show we can be funny without being buffoons. Let's show realistic, dramatic representations of the African American community from the perspective of African Americans. Ryan Coogler destroyed the Hollywood myth that African American culture isn't attractive to the mainstream and unsellable overseas. Now it's time to take the next step to assure our culture is mainstream. I bring to you The Era, a series that will show from our perspective the declination of the African American community, decade by decade, starting with season 1, the 60s. The 60s was a time when the African American community was unified across the United States fighting for civil rights and equality. Families were together. It was rare to see a single parent household. Most people from my parents' generation grew up with both parents in the home. So how did we get to absentee fathers, drug culture, sexism, gang culture, and all the negativity we face today? We will break it down in The Era. Season 2, the 70s, will show you how our fathers, uncles, and other male figures that were supposed to be the leaders of the household came from the Vietnam War addicted to heroin, which led to the cocaine era and birthed the prostitution and addiction era, and that's what broke the families apart for the 80s babies. And the trend continued all the way up till today. Season 3, the 80s. With the addiction era of the 70s, there were lots of overdose victims, which left the kids of the 80s being raised by grandparents, aunts or uncles, or even worse, raising themselves. Then the crack epidemic hits and turns the parents of the 80s babies into zombies. We also had the 90s and the evolution of gang culture, followed by the 2000s and the rebirth of the addiction era. Heroin actually made a comeback, and the beginning of the lean and other opioids in rap and hip-hop culture. These are the stories that need to be told, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, from our perspective. Miss Sneed, that's why we're having this conversation, because we both share the passion to tell the stories that are overlooked and untold. There are people in America and all over the world whose perspective of the African American and African American culture is what they see on TV or on the big screen. So in their eyes, every African American they encounter is either a drug dealer, a gangster, a murderer, a thief, or someone to be afraid of. That's how we lost precious lives like Trayvon Martin, Philando Castillo, and Eric Garner, because people have been programmed to be afraid of us because of the image that is portrayed of us. And the only way to change the perspective is to change the narrative. How are we going to do this, you ask? With the knowledge attained at Full Sail University. Visual storytelling and directing teaches writing, directing, producing, cinematography, all of the tools needed to produce the 2019 American Black Film Festival Jury Award Best Documentary, Breaking the Blue Wall. The documentary where black police officers were interviewed anonymously about their feelings on unarmed blacks such as Trayvon Martin, Philando Castillo, Eric Garner, and Botham Jean being beaten and or murdered by their fellow officers and what they feel should be done about it. They speak on the unacknowledged but definitely enforced quota that superiors deny exists and why they over-patrol minority communities. Visual arts in the entertainment and media industry, along with script writing techniques, were two other classes that taught formation of visual arts, scripting styles, and creative writing that spawned the 2020 American Black Film Festival and Tribeca Film Festival independent film nominated This Can't Be Life. The story of a young African-American male that grew up in a broken home, impoverished and living in gang culture with a genius-level IQ. He used his intelligence to pull himself out of the clutches of the violent, drug-infested upbringing to become an Ivy League graduate and a distinguished federal prosecutor. We have the tools to make changes in our community, but to make changes in our community, we have to make changes to the stereotypical imagery of us and our community. When the portrayal of African Americans and African American culture comes from the perspective of non-African Americans, there's no way for it to be genuine. We have to tell our own stories. We have to change the negative imagery on screen, which in many people's eyes is the only image they have of African Americans and African American culture. Help me change the narrative.
Amos, as president of the Fresh Air Taxi Cab Company, I'm telling you to get behind this thing and push it out of here.